She boarded the flight like anyone else, quiet, unremarkable, just another face in the long line of passengers finding their seats. To the man in 13E, she was the polite woman who asked if he could move his bag. To the flight attendants, she was just a traveler in a brown jacket, sipping water and looking out at the clouds. But 30 minutes after takeoff, when the cabin lights dimmed and the captain's voice suddenly cut off mid-sentence, the ordinary silence of cruising altitude shattered. Through the oval window beside her, two F-22 Raptors slid into formation, so close their steel wings caught the sun and cast shadows across her face. Passengers gasped, flight attendants stumbled down the aisle. But while everyone else pressed back into their seats in fear, she leaned forward, eyes locked on the jets outside. And then it happened. Across the military frequency, carried faintly through the cabin's emergency channel, a single word was spoken, a word the Air Force hadn't uttered in over a decade. A call sign that belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. That word was hers. You're watching The Storyscape, where ordinary faces hide extraordinary pasts. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the untold stories of courage that could change the way you see the world. The climb had been smooth, almost too smooth. Passengers settled in with the practiced rhythm of 100 flights before. Laptops flicked open, earbuds pushed in, plastic cups of soda passed down the aisle. Somewhere behind row 20, a child giggled at a cartoon on a tablet. In row 13, seat F, a woman in a brown jacket leaned quietly against the window, her paperback balanced but unread on her lap. She looked like anyone else, maybe a business traveler, maybe someone visiting family. No one paid her much attention. Then the cabin speakers clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've reached 30,000 feet. You may now—" The voice cut out. Sharp static hissed across the cabin, loud enough to make people wince. Then silence. At first, nobody reacted. A few shrugged, assuming it was just a glitch. But the flight attendants, trained to mask everything, froze for a half second before forcing their professional smiles back into place. They moved briskly, a little too briskly, down the aisle, whispering to each other in clipped tones. The woman in 13F straightened, her eyes narrowing. Then came the jolt. A sharp shudder ran through the fuselage, knocking plastic cups to the floor. The man beside her cursed as soda splashed across his shirt. A woman screamed 2 rows ahead. "Just turbulence," someone said too loudly, as if volume could make it true. But the shudder hadn't felt like turbulence. It felt like the sky itself had been shoved aside. And then, shadows. Through the oval window, 2 sleek shapes slid into view, cutting across the brilliance of the sun. Angular, predatory, unmistakable. F-22 Raptors. They locked into formation on either side of the passenger jet, so close their wingtips seemed to scrape the horizon. Gasps erupted. 100 phones lifted shakily, screens glowing as passengers filmed what they thought might be their last moments of their lives. A boy in the row ahead pressed his face against the glass. "Cool," he whispered. His mother yanked him back, terror etched across her face. In the aisle, a flight attendant dropped a tray. Metal clattered against plastic, the sound brittle and wrong in the hushed cabin. The senior attendant grabbed the intercom handset, tried to speak, but the system only spat more static. Beside her, the man in 13E gripped the armrests. Are we being hijacked?" But the woman in 13F didn't answer. She was staring at the Raptors, her eyes sharp, calculating. While everyone else pressed back in fear, She leaned forward, closer to the glass. Her reflection overlapped with the jet's canopy, as if pilot and passenger were staring straight at each other through layers of steel and glass. And then, through the faint bleed of the cabin speakers, a voice crackled, low, clipped, military, not meant for passengers, not meant for anyone here. One word, not a warning, not a threat, a call sign. The passengers around her frowned, confused, not understanding, but the woman in 13F froze. Her hand tightened around the armrest, her lips parted just slightly, as if she'd heard a ghost speak her name. Because that word, spoken across encrypted frequencies, carried through the static, belonged to her. And no one in that cabin was supposed to know it. The cabin erupted in questions. Passengers turned to one another, voices rising in anxious disbelief. "Did you hear that? What did they say? Was that English?" Phones shook in trembling hands as people tried to capture the sound, replay it, make sense of it. The flight attendants were moving fast now, their practiced calm slipping at the edges. One crouched by the jump seat, speaking urgently into a handset that spat only more static. Another pressed her palm flat against the cockpit door, as if she could feel something through the steel. Her lips moved in silent prayer. In row 13, seat F, the woman hadn't moved. Her face was pale, not with the unfocused fear of the others, but with the shock of recognition. That single word, Spectre, had still echoed in her head. It had been years since she'd heard it, years since anyone had dared to say it out loud. She had buried that part of herself long ago. Spectre was gone, erased from files, scrubbed from reports, sealed in operations that would never reach daylight. The only place that name still lived was in the memory of a select few, men and women who had sworn never to speak of her again. Yet here it was, called out across the skies by a pilot who had no business knowing it. Her seatmate, the man in 13E, was staring at her now. You look like you understood that," he whispered. His voice carried the tremor of someone desperate for an explanation, any explanation. She turned to him slowly. "I didn't," she said, flatly, but her eyes betrayed her. They kept darting back to the Raptors outside, to the gleam of sunlight flashing off their canopies. She could almost see the pilots inside, their helmets reflecting the horizon, their hands steady on the controls. And she knew they weren't here for the plane. They were here for her. Another ripple shook the fuselage, smaller this time, controlled. The jets were signaling. She recognized the pattern instantly, banking left, banking right, holding formation. A silent dance in the sky, the kind only someone with training would understand. They weren't threatening the passenger aircraft. They were speaking to her. All around, panic deepened. A woman clutched her husband's arm and sobbed. A teenager tried to text despite having no signal. A businessman muttered about scrambling the Wi-Fi to send an email. Fear was contagious, spreading in waves, tightening the air in the cabin until every breath felt thin. But in 13F, the woman's breathing slowed. Her pulse, though racing, began to steady. She was slipping into old patterns, old instincts, situational awareness, assess, interpret, decide. She glanced at the cockpit door, still sealed. No voice from inside, no reassurance from the captain. That silence was more telling than anything. Something had gone very wrong up there. And still, through the window,
The F-22s held their vigil, waiting. The man beside her whispered again, desperate in his tone, "Who are you?" She didn't answer, not yet. Instead, she leaned just slightly closer to the glass, her lips parting, as if she might whisper back, not to him, not to the passengers, but to the jets that had called her from the past. Because if they knew her name, if they still remembered Spectre, then the past she thought she had outrun had finally caught her at 30,000 feet. The cabin had settled into a strange kind of chaos, the kind where panic no longer surged in shouts, but in whispers, short breaths, the trembling of hands gripping armrests. The flight attendants moved stiffly now, their reassurances brittle. They repeated the same lines again and again. "Everything is fine. Please remain seated. Please keep calm." But no one believed them. Everyone could see the Raptors pacing the plane, glinting like silent predators in the afternoon sun.
Seat 13F remained still, but inside, her mind was running. She knew those jets weren't flying blind intercept. Their formation was deliberate, their maneuvers precise. And when the right-hand fighter rocked its wings, once, twice, then rolled shallow before settling back in, her chest tightened. She remembered that signal. Years ago, she had flown missions where a gesture like that was as clear as spoken language. Identify yourself. Respond. Spectre. The word replayed in her skull like a drumbeat. Someone out there knew her. Someone who had been told she no longer existed. And now 2 Raptors risked breaking silence over civilian airspace just to call her back from the shadows. The man in 13E couldn't take it anymore. He leaned in, whispering harshly, "I saw your face when they said that word. You know what's happening, don't you?" She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. He wanted an answer, but the look she gave him was enough to make him swallow his next words. It wasn't anger or fear. It was authority. The kind of look that said, "Don't press me. Not now." The plane jolted again, not turbulence, but controlled movement. The Raptors had shifted, boxing the civilian jet in tighter. Passengers gasped, some crying outright. A flight attendant stumbled into the row, clutching the seatbacks. "Please," she begged, her own voice cracking now. "Please stay calm." Then the speakers hissed again. For a moment, it was only static. Then, clearer this time, stronger, the same voice as before. "Spectre, confirm." Every nerve in her body lit up. She hadn't heard that voice in years, but she recognized the cadence. Clipped, professional, the mark of a fighter jock who had drilled in the same skies she once had. Whoever was in that cockpit knew exactly who they were calling. And if they knew, then the command chain knew, which meant her cover, her quiet life, the years she had stolen for herself, they were gone. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she forced them still. She couldn't let anyone see. The intercom beside the cockpit door crackled suddenly, drawing every eye forward. For the first time since the captain's voice had cut off, sound emerged from that steel barrier. A man's voice, strained, uneven. "If anyone on board can help, we've... Static swallowed the rest. Gasps, cries. The implication was clear enough. The pilots were incapacitated. The cockpit was crippled, and 2 Raptors were shadowing them, calling for someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Spectre closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Old instincts whispered through her veins. The time for hiding was over. She had tried to be anonymous, to vanish into ordinary life, but fate, or perhaps the chain of command she thought she had escaped, had pulled her back. When she opened her eyes again, her decision was made. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, deliberately,
the click of the latch sharp in the tense quiet.
"Ma'am, please stay seated." A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, panic edging her voice. But Spectre was already standing, her hand steady on the seatback, her eyes fixed on the locked cockpit door. Passengers stared at her now, some with fear, others with desperate hope. A dozen pairs of eyes silently begged her to say something, to explain, to promise that things weren't as bad as they seemed. But she didn't. She couldn't. Words weren't her weapon right now. Action was. With a slow, measured step, she began to move down the aisle. Each stride seemed to shift the air in the cabin. The whispers around her swelled. Who is she? Does she know what's happening? She's going to the cockpit. She didn't answer them. Her focus was forward, the way it had always been in the skies, narrow, precise, unshakable. The cockpit door loomed closer. Behind it, silence. Beyond the glass canopy outside, two Raptors kept their vigil. And over the crackling channel, one final word came through, low and commanding. "Spectre, we're waiting." She stopped just short of the door. For a moment, the ordinary life she had built flickered in her mind, the anonymity, the quiet mornings, the freedom of not being needed. It vanished like smoke. Her hand rose, steady now, as she pressed it flat against the cold steel. It was time to answer. The aisle had never felt longer. Every step toward the cockpit pulled the weight of 100 stairs behind her, an invisible pressure that seemed heavier than gravity itself. Passengers tracked her movement like a wave rolling through the cabin, whispers following in her wake, breaths held, hands gripping armrests as if the fabric and metal could anchor them to safety. She moved slowly, deliberately, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the cost of speed. Every stride she took carved away the last layer of anonymity she had tried to preserve. The woman in 13F, the quiet passenger in a brown jacket, was dissolving. With each step forward, Spectre resurfaced. The murmurs grew. Where's she going? She knows something. She can't go in there, can she? A mother held her child closer, shielding his face while a businessman muttered curses under his breath. A retired sergeant 3 rows back leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, recognizing something in her posture. Shoulders squared, steps balanced, head level like a soldier moving into position. He whispered to the stranger beside him, "That's not panic, that's training." Spectre heard none of it. Her focus had locked onto the steel door ahead. She had spent years pretending doors like that no longer existed, that she'd never again stand on one side with lives depending on her crossing it. But now, with every blink of the overhead lights and every gasp from the cabin, she felt the past pressing harder, demanding. The lead flight attendant darted in front of her, arms spread wide, panic cracking her voice. "Miss, please sit down. The cockpit is secured. The captain
Won't be speaking again. Spectre's voice cut through her words, quiet but sharp. She hadn't meant to be cruel, but she saw the truth in the captain's silence, in the way the plane had drifted, in the signals from the Raptors outside. Her words froze the attendant in place. Passengers leaned out of their seats, straining to hear. The atmosphere thickened as if oxygen itself had thinned. The attendant tried again with a trembling voice. You can't be back here. Regulations." Spectre's eyes flicked up, pinning her. "If we follow regulations, we don't land. Step aside." The command in her tone didn't belong to a passenger. It belonged to someone who had once carried authority like a blade. The attendant faltered, her lips parting, then shutting without sound. She lowered her arms slowly, retreating by instinct more than choice. A man in 12C rose halfway from his seat, blocking the aisle with a shaking hand. "What do you think you're doing? You can't just—" Spectre stopped, turned her head. Her gaze found his. Whatever he saw there drained the fight from him. His mouth closed. He sat back down, muttering, "God help us," under his breath. Silence followed her again. All the noise, The crying child, the hiss of static overhead, the rattling trays seemed to dim beneath the gravity of her next step. At last, she stood before the door. Cold metal loomed inches from her face. Her hand rose and pressed against it, palm flat, feeling the vibrations of machinery through steel. On the other side, she knew, there was chaos. Flashing alarms, slumped bodies, controls begging for guidance. And then, faintly, the speakers crackled. A voice broken, gasping. "If anyone can help, controls failing, both down." The rest dissolved in static, but it was enough. The passengers erupted again, voices jagged with fear. "Both down? What does that mean? The pilots, are they—" A woman sobbed into her husband's chest. Someone else prayed audibly. Panic threatened to spiral. Spectre closed her eyes for one measured breath. 2 lives warred inside her chest. The ordinary woman she had fought so hard to become, and the Spectre the world had buried. The first wanted to sit back down, to vanish again into the comfort of anonymity. The second knew that if she didn't act now, every person on this plane would be erased from the sky. She opened her eyes. The decision was already made. Her knuckles struck the side panel beside the door. Plastic cracked under precision, and her fingers dug into the seam. Gasps filled the aisle. She ripped it free, revealing a keypad no passenger should have known existed. Lights flickered, an access prompt blinking. She didn't pause. Muscle memory guided her hand, punching a sequence of numbers that should have been forgotten years ago. Her fingers trembled only once when the final key lit up. For a moment, nothing. Then, a solid click. The door released. The attendant stepped back in shock. The murmurs behind her swelled into an audible tide. How does she? That's impossible. Who is she? Spectre pushed the door open, inch by inch. The smell of ozone and sweat rushed out, mixing with the recycled cabin air. Light from the cockpit spilled across her face, stark and unforgiving. And there it was, the truth. Both pilots slumped forward, unmoving, alarms bleeding red across the instruments. The plane screamed for a hand on the controls, and outside, the Raptors still held their vigil, their wingtips catching the sunlight, their presence as sharp as the call sign echoing in her chest. Spectre stepped inside. The door sealed shut behind her with a final thud, severing her from the murmurs, the stares, the ordinary life that had unraveled row by row as she walked that aisle. For the first time in years, she was where she was never meant to be again. The cockpit. And the sky was waiting for her answer. The cockpit was suffocating. Warning chimes pulsed in a relentless rhythm. Red and amber lights flashed across the panels, and the faint smell of overheated circuitry filled the air. The 2 pilots, slumped motionless in their harnesses, looked almost unreal in the strobing glow. Helmets tilted forward, hands limp at their sides. For a heartbeat, Spectre simply stood there, framed by the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the anxious faces crowding behind her in the cabin. Then the door clicked shut. She was alone with the ghosts of her past. Her hand slid across the control yoke, testing. Slack. No immediate response. She scanned the instruments, her eyes darting in practiced patterns. Altitude holding at 31,000 feet, speed bleeding off slightly, autopilot indicators flashing amber. Whoever had programmed the system last had done it on instinct, a dying captain's final attempt to keep the bird steady. But it wouldn't last. The Raptors outside knew it too. Their formation had tightened, flying wingtip to wingtip like watchful sentinels. The lead jet dipped its wing again, urgent, deliberate, a call she could no longer ignore. Spectre reached across the captain's console, fingers dancing over switches. "Come on," she whispered, her voice almost lost beneath the drone of engines. The radio sputtered, static heavy. She adjusted frequencies, bypassed civilian bands, locked on to the encrypted channel that her bones remembered before her mind did. The speaker came alive. "Spectre, respond." Her throat tightened. The code name tasted strange after all these years, bitter and electric at once. She pressed the transmit button. "This is," she faltered, almost said her civilian name, the one on her ticket and passport. But the voice that left her lips was older, steadier, iron-wrapped. "This is Spectre, reading you." Static hissed. Then relief, hard and professional. "Copy, Spectre. You've got the stick?" Her eyes flicked to the limp bodies in the chairs. She swallowed. "Not yet, but I will." Behind her, the muffled roar of the cabin pressed against the sealed door. She could picture the passengers, whispering, demanding answers, trying to reconcile the woman in 13F with the figure now speaking the language of ghosts and warriors. But they weren't her concern now. The plane itself, the lives it carried, were. She slid into the captain's chair, adjusting quickly. Her hands fit the controls like they had never left. Muscle memory surged. Left hand on the throttles, right hand on the yoke, eyes sweeping gauges. It came back faster than she wanted to admit. The Raptor's voice returned. "Orders are to escort you to safe airspace, but you're leaking altitude. Say status." Spectre scanned. The right engine's readings danced erratically. Hydraulic pressure low, control surfaces sluggish. Not catastrophic yet, but in 20 minutes, maybe less, they'd lose real authority over the jet. Her mind calculated. Options spiraled, collapsed, left her with one path forward. "We've got partial control," she transmitted. "All stabilize." "Understood, Spectre. You still have it, don't you?" The voice was edged with something she hadn't expected. Not just recognition, but respect. Whoever sat in that Raptor's cockpit knew the stories. They knew Spectre wasn't just a ghost. They knew why she had been buried. Her jaw tightened. "We'll find out," she muttered. Her fingers moved swiftly, cutting autopilot, trimming flaps, coaxing the heavy jet back into alignment. The aircraft groaned, but responded, sluggish yet alive. Outside, the Raptors adjusted their positions, one sliding slightly ahead, guiding her path like a phantom wingman. Then, from the cabin behind her, a knock, hesitant, almost pleading against the cockpit door. "Please," a voice called, muffled, "tell us what's happening." Spectre didn't turn. She couldn't. To acknowledge them now would mean breaking the thin thread of focus holding everything together. But she spoke, her voice low into the radio, knowing the cabin speakers would carry fragments. "This plane will land," she said, firm, steady. "I need everyone calm." It wasn't a promise. It was an order. And somehow, even through the steel barrier, the passengers felt it. Their murmurs quieted. Fear didn't vanish, but for the first time since the intercom had gone dead, it shifted. Fear became waiting, watching, hoping. Spectre's eyes flicked to the pilots again. She reached across, pressing fingers to the neck of the captain. Faint pulse, still alive. The first officer, too, shallow but present. Relief flickered, brief and sharp, before duty reclaimed her. The Raptor's voice cut in again. "Spectre, confirm intentions." She hesitated. Intentions. The word was heavier than it sounded. Did they expect her to declare herself back in service? To admit she had never truly left? To answer not just as a stranded passenger, but as the ghost they had resurrected? Her hand tightened on the yoke. "Intention is survival," she said. Static filled the channel. Then, "Copy that. We're with you." The jets tightened formation once more. Sunlight struck their wings, flashing across her eyes. For a moment, she was back in another cockpit, another war, the rhythm of flight pounding through her veins. But this wasn't a mission logged in classified archives. This was 300 lives depending on a woman who was never supposed to fly again. Spectre drew a breath, deep and steady. Her voice dropped to a whisper no one else would hear. You buried me once, but the sky never forgets. And with hands that once shaped the fate of battlefields, she pulled the civilian jet back into the fight for its life. The jet's nose dipped slightly as Spectre trimmed the controls, coaxing the wounded aircraft into compliance. Warning lights still screamed across the panels, and the engines groaned in uneven rhythm. But the airliner obeyed, not gracefully, not easily, but enough. Outside, the Raptors flanked her like guardians carved from steel. Their contrails streaked the heavens, one holding steady on her wing, the other pulling ahead, scanning the path. The voice returned through the comm, steady, calm, but carrying a weight Spectre hadn't felt in years. Spectre, you're cleared to divert. Airfield is ready. We'll take you down. She nodded once, though they couldn't see it. Her hands gripped the yoke firmly, but not with desperation, with the familiarity of an old companion returned. She adjusted pitch, stabilized speed, and guided the massive jet into its descent. Behind her, the cabin creaked under the strain of hundreds of breaths held at once. The passengers knew something extraordinary was happening, though they didn't yet have the words. They had felt the shift, the way the plane no longer drifted helplessly, the way purpose had filled the silence. In the aisle, a child whispered to his mother, "She's flying it, isn't she?" The mother pulled him close, but didn't answer. The truth was too strange, too vast. Inside the cockpit, Spectre's focus never wavered. The airspeed bled down, the horizon tilted, and the earth began to swell in the windshield. And with each passing second, her past pressed harder against her chest. Memories of nights spent in hangars, of coded briefings delivered in hushed voices, of missions flown where failure was not an option. She had left it all behind, or she thought she had. But the sky had its own memory, and today it had come to collect. The Raptor's voice cut in again. Altitude on profile. You're flying her clean, Spectre. Feels like old times. Spectre's lips curved just slightly, not a smile, but the faintest echo of one. Old times were quieter, she said, though both knew it was a lie. Old times had never been quiet. The runway appeared, a dark slash across the land below. Emergency vehicles lined its edge, lights flashing like beacons. She guided the heavy jet lower, the wind howling louder against the fuselage, the controls sluggish but yielding. Bring her down, the Raptor called. Spectre exhaled, a steady, grounding breath. Hands firm, eyes sharp, she eased the yoke back, trimmed the flaps, and coaxed the crippled plane onto its final approach. The wheels kissed the asphalt with a jolt that rattled every soul on board, but the aircraft held. Tires screamed, brakes groaned, but the beast slowed, slower, slower, until finally, mercifully, it rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway. Silence fell, a silence so heavy it felt like the whole world had stopped to listen. Then, from behind the sealed cockpit door, it came. Applause, tentative at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation that shook the cabin. Strangers clapped, cried, embraced, their voices rising in disbelief and relief. Spectre sat in the captain's chair, her hands still resting on the controls. For a long moment she didn't move. The old part of her, the one that had been called today, knew she should power down,
hand the bird over, and slip away. But the other part, the woman who had been just another passenger in 13F, longed to vanish again into anonymity. She rose slowly, her knees stiff, her eyes drawn one last time to the Raptors outside. They had broken formation now, banking gracefully into the sky. One dipped its wing in salute, not to the plane, not to the passengers, to her. Her throat tightened. She gave the faintest nod, a gesture no one else would ever see. Then she turned from the window, from the comms, from the life that had clawed its way back into being. The cockpit door creaked as she opened it. Hundreds of eyes stared at her, wide with awe, confusion, and gratitude. Some whispered, some reached out as if to touch her sleeve, to anchor themselves to the miracle they had witnessed. But she didn't stop. She didn't explain. She simply walked past them, back down the aisle where it had all begun, back toward the place where she had tried to live as no one special at all. The name Spectre still echoed in her ears, carried on the hum of engines and the roar of memory. And though she left the plane with nothing but the clothes she had boarded in, every person on that flight, and every pilot who had seen her hands steady the storm, would remember. She was never just a passenger. She was the ghost the sky could not forget.